The Speaker, I can tell you that both initiatives will deliver more than what that last government attempted to when, for instance, they put out a $1 billion infrastructure scheme.
Yeah, tēnā koutou, I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to A View from Afar. And today we are joined by political scientist Paul Buchanan, and we will consider what does Russia's Vladimir Putin want from NATO and the United States in a negotiated diplomatic solution to the Ukraine issue, and what, from Ukraine's perspective, is the most favourable outcome from the threat of the Russian military build-up on its borders. Also, we will discuss, in the United States, there are concerns that once the Beijing Winter Olympics concludes, the People's Republic of China may assert a renewed diplomatic crisis with Taiwan. But does this fit with a renewed Russia-PRC strategic partnership? And what does such a strategic partnership look like? Okay, before we deep dive into these big issues, remember, if you are joining us via live social media platforms, do comment if you so wish to, as we can include this interaction in our program. But let's cross to Paul, who is waiting online to discuss these issues. Good afternoon, Paul.
Kia ora, Selwyn. How you doing?
Yeah, tēnā koe. I'm very good, ka pai, thank you, Paul. So, Paul, just before we kick off, let's just cross over here and look at what Reuters released relating to Vladimir Putin's comments to the German Chancellor Scholz overnight.
We see the forceful constraint of Russia as a direct threat to our national security, and legal obligations based on our drafts are meant to ease that threat. I repeat, the answers for our security guarantees proposals, given to us by the United States and NATO, do not address the three fundamental demands from Russia.
На наш взгляд, не отвечают упомянутым трем базовым российским требованиям. Не присутствует, как мне докладывал вчера министр иностранных дел Российской Федерации, присутствует ряд соображений.
There are some points in the answers we are not only ready to discuss. In fact, it was us who suggested our partners discuss them back in the years. Regarding European security, certain weapon systems, I mean the middle and short-range missiles, military transparency, we are ready to continue our work.
Военной транспарентности. Мы готовы к этой совместной работе и дальше. По поводу, хотим мы этого или нет.
Do we want war or not? Of course not. That is why we have offered our proposals to start the negotiation process, which would lead to an agreement of providing equal security for everybody, including our country.
Договоренность об обеспечении равной безопасности всех, включая нашу страну. Что касается того, как Россия будет действовать дальше. По плану.
As for how will Russia act from now, according to the plan, and how the plan will be made, according to the actual situation. Who can say how the actual situation will develop? Nobody so far. It depends not only on us, but we are going and will strive to agree with our partners on the questions we have raised by diplomatic means.
So, Paul, what do you make of Vladimir Putin's comments there, and also his body language toward the end of that? And do you think diplomacy can win this conflict?
I do, but it's going to be on his terms. He's in the catbird seat. The U.S. is in a moment of weakness. NATO, although it's unifying around its original purpose, which was to counter the Soviet Union, now Russia, still remains, relatively weak and divided when it comes to now the Russian encirclement of the Ukraine. And his demands are not unreasonable if you try to take his point of view. I mean, the bottom line demand is that the Ukraine not be offered, much less accept, NATO membership. He simply does not want another NATO state on his border. And as some commentators have pointed out, if a hostile state put a missile base or a military base of any sort in Mexico, the United States would probably react very poorly. So he's doing what a great power can do, which is pressure the Ukraine and its allies to not pursue the NATO option. But he has a broader picture in mind. And of course, you and I have talked about this as late as last week, in that he wants to, quote unquote, Finlandize Eastern Europe. And by that I mean, Finland is a non-NATO member. Sweden and Austria are not NATO members. But there are former Soviet states, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, that are now NATO members, two of which have borders with Russia. Poland is a NATO member when it used to be a member of the Warsaw Pact. He doesn't want to see any more encroachment on his western borders. And so that's a demand that, he can't undo the fait accompli of NATO membership, but he wants to discuss the nature of military exercises, the nature of NATO troops stationed in those countries. And I think he's going to get most of what he wants. And that, I think, is the best thing to say about this diplomacy, is that because it's so one-sided in favor of the Russians, he's going to get most of what he wants, if not all, and that will resolve the threat of war. If we think about what's the thing that they want to avoid the most, that would be war. The threat of sanctions and whatnot, we can bring that up a little later in the show about how they'll deal with the secondary repercussions. But let's be very clear. The United States is not coming to the rescue of the Ukraine. It may supply it with arms through Romania and surreptitious means, but that's all it's going to do. NATO will not intervene in this. None of them will. What's interesting for us, Selwyn, and this is just a minor aside, is that New Zealand is a NATO partner.
Yeah, in the cybersecurity area most prominently.
Exactly. Well, I was just going to say, any war is going to be, I was kidding with you before the show, it's going to be an electromagnetic cloud of hacking, all sorts of, bad things in the high-tech field. Well, New Zealand, as a NATO partner, shares intelligence through the Five Eyes with NATO. And it is possible, if push comes to shove, that NATO will ask New Zealand to participate in intelligence gathering activities through the Five Eyes. So the GCSB would get involved at that point. That'd be an interesting diplomatic conundrum to resolve. I would imagine that New Zealand would agree, albeit quietly. But beyond that, there's no real ability for the NATO members to respond with force. And I guess the good news, at least in my mind, is that contrary to many Western commentators, I don't think that the Russians have any intention of taking over the entirety of the Ukraine. And with the numbers of troops they have assembled, they cannot do it. They can seize it, perhaps. They'll have trouble holding it for any length of time, I mean, as in 30 days, and they certainly cannot occupy it. So I think their objectives on the ground are going to be territorially limited and will make the point that they take this issue much more seriously than many of the public in places like the United States. And so their demands should be met one way or the other.
Now, one of the things that we touched on last week relating to this issue was how borders do not necessarily reflect the alliances culturally that the populations may express. For example, there's parts of Ukraine where we know they basically affiliate to Russian identity, Russian culture, Russian language, Russian trade, Russian business. In many respects, those borders do not reflect the realities on the ground. Overnight, for example, we saw the Ukrainian president speaking to that and talking very colloquially in his fashion, because it's Unity Day, obviously yesterday or overnight in New Zealand time with Ukraine. And he was speaking about what unity meant, and unity as a culture, as a country, that they are stronger and firmer in that respect. When we also talk about Russia and its view here, and like we know of what happened in 2014 with the Crimea area and other areas to the southeast of Ukraine, Russia sees its identity that those territories are its, and that it is claiming them as its own. And obviously, there's been a military presence ever since 2014 when the Russian hardware rolled over those borders. What I'm getting at here, Paul, is there's something that New Zealand economic historian Keith Rankin raised. I might just actually bring that up over here on Evening Report this week, and write down when he kind of makes mention of a similar kind of thing. And he talks about here, for example, this paragraph here under current events, for a Ukrainian nation to go ahead and forge substantial ties with the European Union, it does not have to be distracted by its hitherto peripheral territories, which have always been less keen to embark on that nationalist journey. For Russia, and here's the important part in this paragraph, for Russia, it would seem the critical issue is that the 5 ambiguous territories remain their present ambiguity. The Russian leadership might be more concerned, Keith is talking about, of defence rather than invasion. That if you're talking about NATO, and it's something, just breaking away from Keith's piece, is something that Vladimir Putin mentioned last week, and he was talking about the dangers of Ukraine moving into NATO, that if Ukraine then asserted itself to actually retake those territories that Russia took in 2014, it would enact the sections in NATO that would cause conflict. And there's a school of thought that is coming out from some of the historians, and Keith Rankin among them, that what Putin is doing is a defensive maneuver of that very broad border with Ukraine right at the top, north, the east, and Ukrainian border, and the south, and that is there to try and force to make sure that Ukraine does not seek NATO membership, does not then seek to reclaim its territories that would actually create a conflict. That I think is pretty much in colloquial in ordinary parlance of what is being suggested there. What is your response to those kind of that thinking? And do you think that is an indication of the motivations of Russia's Vladimir Putin at this stage?
I do. It's literally creating a buffer zone within a buffer zone for Russia. Let's be very clear. The Donbass region, the administrative territories of Luhansk and Donetsk, are majority Russian ethnic in their demographic, and the majority of those people are loyal to Moscow, not to Kiev. It is possible that in a very limited territorial war, the Russians would simply move into those regions where they'd be welcomed, and as has been suggested in Moscow, declare them to be independent states. And that would then become the buffer between the Ukraine and Russia itself. It would be leaning towards Russia. It would be very much dependent on Russia the way Belarus is. And it would be Finlandized, if you want to put it that way, because there would be no immediate territorial threat emanating from eastern and southern Ukraine. And of course, I'm thinking about Crimea as well. If he expands a little further, that is, if his territorial ambitions in a war were to run up to the Dnieper River, and Kiev is situated on the northern banks of the Dnieper River. So we can see this in the map. He could take all of eastern Ukraine and not move into western Ukraine, which doesn't have the ethnic Russian population that would support his troops. And in doing so, he would open up land access to the Crimean Peninsula, which has always been an objective of Russian military strategists. And so it's possible that he might want to extend his ambition all the way to the de facto divide between eastern and western Ukraine. There's nothing anyone can do about that, and as you see there, he would be sending troops from Belarus. He's put in there under the guise of exercises right now. They have massed Russian troops in Belarus who will obviously support them in any endeavor to go in. I don't know about the dotted line coming to the west of Kiev. I do think if he wanted to, the solid green lines, he could run his troops up to Kiev and circle the eastern side of Kiev, and then issue ultimatums. My thought is this: he may well take the separatist-controlled territories, since he has de facto control of them anyway, and they're loyal to Moscow. Getting further into the Ukraine, he will win any territorial confrontation, but it'll be a little more costly because there are Ukrainian troops in eastern Ukraine, so blood will be shed, but he might be able to achieve that. But if he doesn't have to do any of that, because the Ukrainians accede to their demands and then the Europeans accede to his broader demands about creating buffer zones in what used to be the western flank of the Soviet Union, or what we know as Eastern Europe, then everybody will be able to go home. The question is, what sort of saving face gesture can be made so that the West doesn't look like it's powerless? And there's a couple things. We'll mention this a little later. The Chinese are looking at this as a test of Western resolve in the event that they decide to make a move on Taiwan. Now, the circumstances are very different, but the Chinese are very much looking at this Russian action of intimidation, if you will, to see how the West will respond. And you know, it could well be that if the response is not, you know, is completely lanking, and we'll see what these sanctions do, then they might become emboldened to, you know, engage in coercive diplomacy of their own vis-a-vis the Taiwanese. I still think that's a way off. But the key here is what sort of concession would the Russians make to allow the West to save face? And I can only think of one major one, and Putin alluded to it. The intermediate range ballistic missile treaty is now basically on a year-to-year basis. The Trump administration abandoned it. The Biden administration signed back on for a year, but the Russians want it renegotiated, and many in Washington would like it renegotiated. It could be that gets put back on the table, sort of as a bone thrown to Washington in exchange for what the Russians want vis-a-vis Eastern Europe. If that's the case, we'll get more security down the road if they are able to sign an intermediate range ballistic missile treaty that's updated, might even include the Chinese, you never know. But certainly right now, the ball is in the Russians' court. I completely disagree with the Western strategists who think that Putin's backed himself into a corner. As I've said before, I think he's in the catbird seat, and that one way or another, either with a limited territorial war or hopefully without firing a shot, the Russians will get what they consider to be their legitimate security demands recognized. Just as a final point, we just have to try to stand in the Russians' perspective. Their geopolitical orientation is all about buffer zones around Mother Russia. You and I have discussed this before, and whether we like it or not, that's their bottom line. That's their absolute bottom line. And so it has to be respected. You know, they base their military strategy on creating a buffer from what they perceive as hostile states. You and I may say, well, the Ukraine is not a threat. Estonia is certainly not a threat. But the threat is not just military, it's political. The more these countries are absorbed into the Western European world, the more they're antithetical to the political belief system in the Kremlin. And we've talked about that axis of authoritarianism versus the axis of so-called liberal democracies. For Putin and his cohort, this is not just a military equation. It involves encirclement of a political sort, and they won't stand for that either.
Yeah. So if we have a look at this from the Ukrainian perspective, it seems that if we go back to November last year, Ukraine was expressing a desire to enter into NATO. We've seen by degrees over the last 2.5 months that desire easing back, and also the change of tempo, the change of dialogue with respect toward Russia from the heart of the government of Ukraine, changing to a more independent position. Now, some may say, Paul, that the tipping point to that change was when the United States strode into this particular dialogue very forthright, that perhaps Biden seized his own opportunity and initiative with respect to getting into a one-on-one diplomatic position ahead of NATO and against or engaging with Putin on this whole entire issue. And Ukraine felt it was being squeezed out. Do you see, or what I should put it, what do you see as the best case scenario for NATO, for Ukraine right now with respect to NATO, from Ukraine's perspective with respect to the Russians, and also adding in something you touched on before, that it does appear that the Russians are using new cyber warfare, cyber techniques, cyber invasions, DDoS type of attacks on those countries, but including Ukraine at this time. Do you believe Ukraine needs to appease Russia at this stage to say what it wants that is different from the latter part of last year?
Yeah, your last sentence sums it up. Let's be very clear, Selwyn. The United States has grossly mishandled the Ukraine. And that goes back to the Obama administration. The interference in the color revolutions and the overthrow of the pro-Russian president with a series now of pro-Western presidents was grossly mishandled. The CIA's fingerprints were all over the so-called popular movements in these colored revolutions, and the Russians are acutely aware of that. Trump's handling of the Ukraine was a rolling disaster that wound up, as we well know, winding up in his impeachment because he wanted the Ukrainians to influence U.S. elections. The Ukrainians have to understand that for the time being, and by time being I mean a couple of decades, they need to try to chart a course that leaves them independent, but free from the interference of both East and West. The United States is not their good friend, and I think that needs to be understood. The Russians have clearly made the Ukrainians understand that they may want to be in NATO, but they're going to wind up being under the Russian boot if they persist in this quest. And I think the Ukrainians have now realized that it is better to have sovereignty and independence, even if Finland dies, that is, even if neutered, rather than be occupied. And, you know, it's possible that the negotiations can result in a settlement where the Ukrainians are free to conduct bilateral military exercises with nations of their choosing, Western nations of their choosing, but they would be limited in scope, nothing that could be perceived as a threat on Russia. And the Russians can live with that. You know, it's very possible that they can live with that. The Ukrainians will have to stop making claims on Crimea. They will have to, unfortunately for them, give up their sovereignty claims on the Crimean Peninsula. But again, if they're allowed to remain independent and unoccupied, that's a heck of a lot better than the option. So it is true, the Ukrainians could engage in a protracted guerrilla war if they go on underground in the face of a Russian armored assault. And it is possible that with Western help, they could engage in this protracted war so that it became like Afghanistan for the Russians. It became a death by 1,000 cuts. My understanding is that the Russian public is not 100% behind this venture, unlike many other ventures. For example, the invasion of Georgia, which was done for exactly the same reason. The Russians annexed 2 significant chunks of Georgian territory, which they now consider to be Russian-occupied independent states, to make the point that Georgia could not go into NATO, and it did not. So they have a track record here. They're not to be trifled with. And so the Ukrainians, have to understand these guys made business. What is the best way for us to remain independent and have some control over our own affairs? Well, I would say listen to the Russians. Do not listen to the United States. As much as I regret saying this, as someone who was born in the United States, if push comes to shove, the United States will not come to the Ukrainians' rescue, and that's the bottom line.
Yeah. So if we just look at that scenario, where this is like the worst case scenario, and the Centre for Strategic and International Studies examined this and published this particular document that back in the end of January. So we'd just say wild tempers were at their zenith, if you like, from the 2 significant powers and NATO. Now, it's saying here, and we brought up this map and spoke to it earlier on, it takes it a bit further, and it goes here about those southern states and what could be an advantage for Russia, for example, if on that southern flank of Ukraine, where it firms up, like you mentioned, Paul, land-based access to Crimea. Basically, it shores up the Ukrainian port of Odessa, and it gives it access to that enclave between Moldova and Ukraine as well. Then the Centre for Strategic International Studies also takes it another step about with Russia going right into Ukraine, and you can see there where it's working out on a map of those movements in phase 2 should things go completely awry diplomatically. The questions around this, I should say, in that map to the north there, which is in like a deep purple mauve kind of colour, that's with respect to Chernobyl and the no-go zone around Chernobyl there. With this particular scenario, Paul, do you believe that Russia would be able to sustain that type of occupation? And are we seeing, for example, the supply lines in behind the military build-ups on Ukraine's border that have been there for a good couple of months now? Have we seen the supply lines, the logistics that would be required for a phase 2 push should things go awry like this?
Well, I have a lot of respect for the strategists at CSIS, but I disagree with them in this instance. First of all, I don't think that 140 to 150,000 Russian troops are going to be able to occupy all of the Ukraine for any length of time. But that depends on the Ukrainian resistance. If the Ukrainian resistance is light, if they fold away, and again, in the east they will, then they can move up, right up to the outskirts of Kiev and the Dnieper River, and basically hold sway there. They cross that river. They start moving into western Ukraine. They're going to start encountering increased resistance by ethnic Ukrainians. Again, not ethnic Russians anymore. Vast majority are Ukrainians. They don't much like the Russians, which has always been a part of the problem in the Ukraine. And I think at that point, they run the risk of getting bogged down. Plus, at that point, NATO will respond. Now, it may not want to engage the Russians directly. In fact, Biden made a point that I learned in graduate school during the Cold War, which is the last thing you want is Americans shooting Russians and vice versa, because that runs the risk of escalation into nuclear war. NATO is aware of that as well. So I don't think we're going to get NATO troops going into the Western Ukraine. But they will do everything short of that to thwart the Russian advance, and they will do it way before they cross the river. They will start, engaging in cyber warfare of their own. As I said, electromagnetic warfare to thwart all of the Russian communications. I mean, it's going to get heavy in a hurry if they do move as far west as the outskirts of Kiev and, cut off land access to the Crimea. But as I said, if they limit their ambitions to that or less, I have a feeling they'll get their way. I just think it would be folly for the Russians to try to run all the way to the western borders of the Ukraine, because among many other things, then they will be sitting face to face with NATO troops. And obviously the Americans will send reinforcements. And guess what? That puts us back into the Cold War. We'll return to a situation that we thought was resolved 35 years ago. I don't think the Russians want that, but I think they're willing to accept that as the new status quo. And this all goes back to what we talked about last week. The bigger play here is that the international system is being rearranged, and it's being rearranged through force and threats of the use of force. And nowhere is there a clearer example of a post-Cold War rearrangement than what we're seeing right now in the Ukraine and the broader reaches of Eastern Europe.
So we'll just take a quick transition, and then we'll come back and we'll discuss the Russia People's Republic of China strategic relationship. And also just overnight, New Zealand time, we had the president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, visiting the Kremlin, had a one-on-one meeting with Putin. And what does that signal? We'll come back to Paul on that in a short. Yeah, welcome back. And Paul, let's pick up this. We touched on it briefly earlier but let's just dig into it for a time. This strategic relationship between Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China. We saw, for example, at the opening of the Olympics, the Winter Olympics in Beijing, there was a lot of politics being in play. Of course, there would be with Vladimir Putin there, a lot of handshaking, a lot of statements coming out. Quite lengthy ones between the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China. What did you make of that, and also what do you make of Bolsonaro being at the Kremlin?
You're right about the length of the joint statement that Putin and Xi released right before the Olympics, 5,500 words, pretty detailed. It basically, they're forming or reaffirming and improving their strategic partnership. And the two main areas are they will now have improved, advanced, and more regular bilateral military exercises, which not only integrate their forces better, but also allow them to extend security guarantees to each other, because there have been clashes between the PRC and the Soviet Union back then over their common border. So this is a way of reaffirming that they're on the same side of the ledger, the authoritarian ledger, if you will. The other one is they're going to increase the flow and actually the actual conduits of natural gas exports from Russia to the People's Republic.
Yeah.
So the China is going to be able to diversify its dependency on fossil fuels, energy sources, courtesy of the Russians. The third part, which talked about their commitments to each other, but was mostly a case of reading between the lines or reading what was unwritten, was in the diplomatic realm. Because if Russia goes into the Ukraine, and I'm sure the Chinese completely agree with the Russian point of view with regards to buffer states and the like, then in the event of severe sanctions levied against Moscow, the Chinese will do everything in their power to help the Russians circumvent those sanctions. And if the Chinese decide to do that, which I have no doubt they will, then the sanctions will be largely ineffectual. And it's already known that many of the Russian oligarchs and Putin himself are moving assets, financial assets, out of Europe, out of the UK in particular, but moving them to neutral states or Asian states where they won't be able to be reached by the US-led sanctions regime.
That's fascinating. So this is beyond the Panama Papers type of things that was reported earlier last year.
Yeah. And again, I mean, if you think of places like Hong Kong, if you think of places like Macau, I mean, those have direct Chinese control. And then a host of other countries that have always been used for money laundering and the like. Heck, recently there have been some interesting reports. The New Zealand police has actually brought out a report about the surge in organized crime activities in the South Pacific. And as it turns out, the Cook Islands is developing a reputation for being rather unsavory when it comes to casting a blind eye on the activities of, let's call them, dark forces. So there's room for the Russians to maneuver, but having the Chinese at their back, or backing them up, gives them a lot of leeway when it comes to avoiding those sanctions. So what we're seeing, I mean, interesting, you and I have talked about it for well over a year, and we've kept it sort of theoretical. That is, we've said what we're seeing is the international system is shifting from a liberal order to something else. We're not quite sure what it will look like, but certainly now there is this juxtaposition of authoritarian powers vying for control of the international system, or at least greater influence in it. And what that tells me is that the international order is no longer being made in the image of the West. Those post-colonial dictums are gone, and now we're seeing the influence of authoritarians, and that's where Bolsonaro comes in. I mean, Bolsonaro, I hate to say this to my Brazilian friends, and I've lived in Brazil for fairly extended periods of time, so it pains me to say this, but he's driving Brazil into irrelevancy because he's absolutely mad. He went over to Moscow to sign an energy deal.
At a time where this whole crisis with Ukraine is at its most sensitive position on the timeline, he was monosyllabic in his responses to Vladimir Putin at their one-on-one stand-up before the press. And you could see even Putin looking across at him kind of a bit bemused by that. What did you make of that kind of acting that Bolsonaro was playing at?
Well, I mean, I follow Brazil because of my love of Latin America and my affection for the country. But it would have been great to be a fly on the wall with Putin, because I'm sure he doesn't follow Brazil the way I do. And, Bolsonaro's a certifiable nutcase. And so he must have been looking over there and going, but surely you have notes where you're going to say something diplomatic about the Ukraine, right? I mean, you're going to say something about it.
He didn't.
And instead, Bolsonaro was true to his word. He told the Brazilian press, I'm not talking about the Ukraine. This is about energy. It's about cultural exchanges between Brazil and Russia. And he was true to his word. He got asked questions, and it was like, yes, no. I mean, and I would say it's because when he says he doesn't want to talk about the Ukraine, he's got this Trumpian ability to not be interested to the point that he won't read about it. He simply, when he...
Ignorance is bliss.
He couldn't answer.
What's ignorance is bliss in a sense? So what is the shape of the strategic relationship that the Russian Federation and Brazil were illustrating overnight with the meeting, the bilateral between Bolsonaro and Vladimir Putin?
Well, I mean, here's the thing. And again, it makes me feel good because you and I haven't been far off the mark in sort of visualizing what's coming. But Putin's been able to court another authoritarian in a country that's nominally democratic and add him to his quiver, if you will. You know, the Brazilians may not condemn a Russian invasion of the Ukraine. I mean, you know, he may be able to start carving out authoritarian-minded people. He's got another one. Viktor Orban in Hungary has already come out. And Hungary is a NATO member. And Viktor Orban has come out and said that he would not support NATO intervention one way or the other in the event of a Russian invasion. There's another authoritarian leader in an ostensibly democratic country. And there's plenty where those came from. Think of Erdogan in Turkey. That would be a prize. So, you know, I think that this is manifest proof that there is now shaping up a coalition of authoritarian states who are willing to challenge the Western primacy over the entire international order, its institutional fabric, if you will, because this is the moment of opportunity. And that, too, is a bottom line. None of this would have happened if the United States and the West had remained, you know, resolute, resolved, and united. But the endless wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere, and then the internal polarization of not just the United States, but other Western democracies has crippled them. And there is no unity of purpose. I mean, this whole reaction to the Russians is a knee-jerk defensive reaction. There's nothing proactive in it. And if you're knee-jerk defensively reacting to a threat of force, you've pretty much lost the terms of debate. So I think this is the moment of opportunity for authoritarians to make their move. The question is, what are the limits of that move? Does the move extend to China trying to reoccupy Taiwan? I think that might be a stretch too far. On the other hand, the Ukraine is eminently doable from the Russians' perspective, and who knows what people like Erdogan are thinking when it comes to their immediate surrounds. So you know, unfortunately, it's more proof that the authoritarians in the world are on the ascendant, and liberal democracies are on the descendant, at least in the current balance of power.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that last point there, Paul, with respect to what is the next moves relating to the strategic relationships that are being forged by Russian Federation and People's Republic of China. We'll obviously be analysing and watching that space, and if we pick up any definitive issues of shape there, then we'll bring those to you in future programs. Until next week, when we'll be back around midday New Zealand time on the Thursday, which is around 6 p.m. on the eastern coast of the United States on a Wednesday evening. Until that time, watch the space, take care, and we'll look forward to having you again on the road. Oh, and I should just say thank you to those that have been commenting on the social media platforms. Been quite a robust interaction that's been going there, and I've been bringing those up as we've been going through the program, and I encourage people to keep the debate going if they so choose to. Thank you. Goodbye for a view from afar and from Paul this week.